Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Aspen Strategy Group's book launch of our book, Domestic and International Disorder, A Strategic Response. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Security Forum. It's a pleasure to have everyone with us. I want to just say a word about our organization. The Aspen Strategy Group was formed 36 years ago in Aspen, Colorado, by a group of Americans who had a radical notion, and that is that Republicans and Democrats and independents can have good conversations with each other, can work together about the future of the United States, and particularly about the future of our national security. One of those founders is with us today, our co-chairman, Joe Nye, professor of Harvard University. He co-chairs the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum with our friend, Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, now president of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. We're also joined by our director, Anya Manuel of Stanford University and the Rice-Hadley Gates Group. And it's a pleasure to work with all of these people in furtherance of a nonpartisan discussion of foreign policy. We meet as a group all together in Aspen, Colorado, but albeit this year virtually, not in Aspen, to discuss big issues concerning American foreign policy. This past summer, we thought we'd discuss three issues that were at the heart of our national debate. The first, of course, is race, the lack of racial equality and racial justice in the United States. Second, we had a very long conversation about the major foreign policy challenges facing our country in 2021, whether it's going to be in a second Trump term or a first Biden term. And finally, we also discussed, and we've been discussing this issue for years, how should the United States respond to the challenge to our power posed by China in the Indo-Pacific and globally. So our lineup today is to have a series of rapid conversations about all these issues. We'll begin in just a minute with a conversation on race with Ambassador Earthren Cousin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and with Deanna Farrell, president and CEO of the J.P. Morgan Institute. That conversation, which I will moderate, will be followed by a second conversation on the future of our foreign policy. And that conversation will be with the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, Jane Harmon, one of our members, with Tori Taussig of Harvard University, who is an expert on the transatlantic relationship, and with our member and fellow director, former director, Professor Philip Zelikow of the University of Virginia. Following that, Anya Manuel, our director of the Aspen Strategy Group, will interview Zoe Baird of the Markle Foundation in New York about the global economy and the work of the Markle Foundation. And we're very grateful to the Markle Foundation, which has been one of our most sustained supporters, financial supporters, and intellectual supporters over the last decade. And finally, Anya is going to moderate a conversation on China with Professor Joe Nye, with Tom Pritzker, Chairman and CEO of Hyatt, and with our good friend, Naima Green-Riley, former member of the American Foreign Service, now a PhD candidate at Harvard University. So that's the lineup. Thank you for joining us. And let's proceed to our first panel discussion. If we can ask them to pop up on the screen. Ambassador Earthren Cousin, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Deanna Farrell of the J.P. Morgan Institute. Welcome to the three of you.
Thank you.
There's Deanna, I see you, good. Ayaan, welcome, Earthren, welcome. Earthren, let me start with you, and I'm really gonna try to ask for your guidance here on all of you. How should the American people respond to what we've been through over the past summer, these unprecedented demonstrations, many of them, most of them largely peaceful, of African Americans, of Latinx Americans, of white Americans taking to the streets in response to the George Floyd incident, in response to centuries of a lack of racial justice. There seems to be energy in the United States, across the country, to try to do something practical to move the country forward. And Ambassador Cousin, Earthren, I know you've got strong views on this, and you also have a lot of experience globally as well as nationally thinking about this issue. And I thought you should start this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this conversation today because it's an important one. And as someone who's had the opportunity to represent this country in a multilateral setting and stand before the nations of the world and say on behalf of the people of the United States of America, this is a country that I love. And it's a country that has been very good to me personally, but as a close friend of all of ours once said, that racial prejudice is the birth defect of our nation. And so I think that the first thing that we have to do as a nation before we can make sustainable, durable change is to acknowledge the problem. The reality of the structural challenges in our society that have been created by our racial animus, because you can't take and you can't solve deep-rooted structural problems until you accept the existence of those problems. And the challenge of racial of what we've seen in the last months is that we have communities that live without hope, and we have an opportunity to begin to develop that hope and the possibility of prosperity in those communities by closing the Black wealth gap. The reality is, in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Black Americans owned 0.5% of the national wealth. Today, Black Americans own 1.5% of the national wealth. So building Black wealth and opportunities for Black capitalism is not new. During the 1960s, everybody agreed. The moderates, the radicals, the integrationists all agreed that building Black capital, Black wealth was part of the solution for moving our nation forward towards Black equity and justice. But yet in 2017, the top 100 Black-owned businesses listed in Black enterprise collectively grossed $27 billion and employed about 79,000 people, compared to Walmart, which earns 20 times more than all 100 of those businesses and employed 2.2 billion people. And Black Americans comprise 15% of the total American population. And one hypothesis suggests if Black businesses were able to reach parity with overall population, that we could create some 600,000 new jobs and add $55 billion annually to the US economy. So beginning with creating that economic opportunity, I think is crucial to addressing the challenges that we are witnessing today, we're witnessing them today as a nation, but they're a reality for our communities, and that goes beyond what we are acknowledging in this conversation today and what we've seen over this past summer.
Ambassador Earthrin, thank you so much. I know you've seen this problem both from a domestic perspective as an American citizen and as a US government official, but you're also executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. You've seen this inequality issue of income, of opportunity from a global perspective. And by the way, congratulations to the World Food Program on its Nobel Peace Prize, fully deserving. And you should feel, I'm sure you feel really proud of your contributions to that. It's interesting that Deanna, in the paper that she wrote for our book that we're inaugurating today, the Aspen Strategy Group book, Domestic and International Disorder, Deanna wrote that Black and Hispanic families in the United States have just 30 to 40 cents in liquid assets for every dollar held by white families. And while Earthrin has introduced this subject, Deanna, I thought maybe we should just ask you to expand on what you wrote in the book.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for your comments, Ambassador. I think that's right. We have, through our work, documented this very large racial gap in financial outcomes, both in income, where Black and Hispanic families have about 70 cents on the dollar of white families, but most notably on the wealth gap, where it's, as you point out, Nick, 30 to 40%. And I think it's important to note that the white-Black gap is starkest in the top quintile, meaning that even high income doesn't protect some of these communities of color from this wealth gap. And the reasons for this, as we all know, have been documented extensively for people who are willing to educate themselves on the explicit policies and practices that have permeated both the public sector and the private sector, starting with intergenerational transfers of wealth, tax policies that perpetuate that, long existing neighborhood conditions, poverty rates, home values, and redlining, outright racial segregation and discrimination in education and labor markets. And so until we develop a path toward addressing that underlying gap, we're unlikely to make progress. I put this in the context of other work we've done across all Americans. It just happens to be even more stark for communities of color, which is that most Americans live with very high levels of financial instability, very high levels of income volatility, and therefore spending volatility. And as we've documented in the work that we've done on race, that financial volatility is much, much more detrimental to communities of color than it is to whites, although this is true for all Americans across all income spectrums, except for the top quintile, where at that point, families are buffered enough through their liquid assets to withstand the kind of volatility that they're exposed to. But to put a fine note on it, we see this both when you see increases in liquidity. So a downside, loss of a job, for example, for every dollar of lost income, a white family has to reduce their consumption by 28 cents. A Black family will have to reduce their consumption by 43 cents. So events like job losses, which are been so extensive during this recession, but other times too, hit Black and Latino families much, much more starkly. On the flip side, where you have large liquidity boosts, such as a tax refund, you also see disproportional impacts where white families, of course, respond to that with a 38% increase, but Blacks and Hispanics with significantly higher increases. The reason that's important is it shows the ability to smooth consumption is much, much lower for communities of color because they don't have this buffer. So you ask, Nick, what can we do? I agree with the ambassador. First thing is to educate ourselves about what's really happening here. And then in reality, we have many of the tools in place through various programs already part of the repertoire of our government, some of which were used, I think, successfully in the CARES Act and others, to provide not just private insurance, meaning help people with savings and buffers to withstand volatility and change, but also with public insurance. And so unfortunately, it's not the one thing, it's a basket of things that we can do, but I'd start with the set of things that are available to reduce financial volatility, access to UI. The CARES Act was successful in expanding access to the unemployment insurance in a way that allowed many, many more people to kind of withstand the fallout that might come. Paid sick leave. Unbelievably, only 17% of Americans actually have full paid sick leave and family leave. We can fix that. That's part of maintaining kind of that buffer. We can do a number of things to boost income, particularly for those in low income. Minimum wage levels, the supplement demonstrated just how valuable that was as a mechanism to shore up low income families. The EITC and expanding the earned income tax credit, healthcare, accessible housing are all part of the solution. And again, we have many of these programs, but we have purposely enabled too many restrictions on those programs for people who most need them. I think there are some new ideas floating around that are also beneficial to consider, like baby bonds. Some countries and areas have introduced those as ways to close that wealth gap early on in people's lives. Many critical assistance programs actually have asset limits that limit people's ability to take advantage of them, and some restructuring of that would do. So I do think there's a very critical role in both acknowledging the issue and for policy, service providers, and employers to play in addressing it.
Thank you, Deanna. Based on what you've just said and what Earthrin said, I want to ask Ayan. I know, Ayan, you've been thinking about the educational gaps, opportunity gaps for African Americans and other disadvantaged groups. A lot of people are saying that maybe one of the impacts of the coronavirus, the pandemic that we're going through, and the economic crisis will lead to a new effort to try to boost the social safety net, a new effort that government needs to be stronger, not weaker, not just state governments, but the federal government to support people who are lower income, that the coronavirus has exposed the inequity in healthcare and in income that both Earthrin and Deanna have talked about. Do you agree with that? And how do you think about that big question of a new reform movement to strengthen government's ability to support people?
So Nick, thank you so much for putting this together and actually for putting, making a priority of this point on race and the inequality that we have in the United States and across the world. I want to thank both speakers for their input. I think the coronavirus has exposed a number of things, but even before the coronavirus, I would say the election in 2016 of Donald Trump exposed those things to me. I don't know about other people. I've been seeing the heightened inequality and the topic of inequality, at least since 1989, and the fact that it can lead to instability. Now, I want to take one step back and say then what kind of philosophy informs us on how to deal with these inequalities. We have, on the one hand, I would say roughly two schools of thought, and one school of thought is what I would like to regard as the grievance model. People come out either organized or disorganized, but in any case, they're able to put on the table what their grievances are. And a competing school of thought with that is the opportunity model. That is, well, once we've seen these inequalities, then what on earth do we do about those inequalities? I think that the strength of the grievance opportunity is that it makes us all aware, as we've seen now in the most stark way, since the killing of George Floyd, that yes, we do have racial disparities in the United States. It's intense. People get really emotional about it. But yes, we have, and that's the strength of the grievance model. Then you have to move on to then what do we do about the inequality? And I would say, I think the answer lies in actually living up to what I call American values, right? It's that promissory note in the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, that allowed Americans in a very different way to deal with the history of slavery, with the history of segregation, Jim Crow, all of that. Now I have, we talked about buckets of solutions. I have 5 key aspects that I think we really need to be looking at. The first is to say, okay, what do we do about those who are formally excluded on racial, but not just racial segregation? There's gender, religion, and other aspects that people were excluded. And the first action you take is to change the laws. When I look into the history of the United States of America, I see, okay, the laws have been changed. Second point, then we have to provide them, and the 2 other speakers have talked about this today, we have to provide them with the prospects that they were excluded from. I underscore education, education, education. I find myself growing up in a very poor country and being female and being excluded from everything we take for granted in the United States. One thing that I would say that lifted me out of that was education. And now we live in the age of information, knowledge. Yes, let's provide them with those prospects. And for that, yes, we need a stronger, healthier government, because it's not just about when you get educated, but then you need to have access also to economic sources, health and safety, well-being. We have to allocate those resources, period. Number 3, we have to prioritize. And I know that this is it's almost taboo, but we do have to prioritize the dismantling of criminal networks, such as gangs, human trafficking syndicates, the people who make neighborhoods for women and children and the vulnerable just unsafe. The government, it is a government duty to dismantle those criminal networks. Number 4, we have to create the equal opportunity and understand that we can't go on saying our system, the American system, it's systemically racist, it's structurally racist. If we have structures that are racist, then let's reform those structures. Let's reform the criminal justice system, the policing system, law enforcement. Let's reform those. But I absolutely disagree with any kind of view that says let's dismantle them all together. If you dismantle the police, the first people who are affected and thrown back into poverty are indeed Black people. It is the vulnerable, it's Hispanics, it's women. So all these notions about dismantling institutions is not something that I'm backing. And then finally, the 5th point is let's encourage and expect individual agency and responsibility. I would say let's beware of the racism of low expectations. The government can do so much, society can do so much, but it all ends up being up to the individual family, the neighborhood, the association. It's their responsibility to lift themselves out of poverty. And if we don't have all of these perspectives on the table, I don't think we're going to get to where we are. I think what I'd like to see is 40 years from now, 50 years from now, we look back and we say, in 2020, we had this enormous problem. We all came together, independents, Republicans, Democrats, and we had that American values approach of we're going to solve this problem, and we solved it. We no longer have it. That is my hope, and I think we can do it. But we have to be honest, we have to be explicit, and we have to allow all of these different perspectives to come on the table. We can't say something is going to be taboo. For instance, the absent fathers in the Black and African American community, that's something we need to discuss. I know it is sensitive, I know people hate it, but you can't solve the problem without putting that aspect of it also on the table. Thank you.
Ayan, thank you very, very much. Thanks to the 3 of you. We just have 6 minutes left. And so I'm just going to ask you all the same question based on what you've all said. What would you say to the next president of the United States would be the most important thing that he could do to begin the process of righting the injustice? Obviously, these are very different people. In my personal view, Donald Trump's been playing the race card in the election. He's been dividing us by race. He's the worst thing that's happened to us in a long time. The way he's responded, the way he's against Black Lives Matter. Joe Biden, a very different record in the way he's talking about the country. So, in either scenario, or just choose the person you want to give advice to, what's the most important thing that the president should be doing to mobilize the government and the country? As Ayan said, it's not just a government function, it's individual as well, to begin to get at the root of the problem so we can make progress. And I apologize, this summer, we had hours of discussion with Governor Deval Patrick, Condoleezza Rice, Mitch Landrieu, Earthrin Cousin, lots of people, and we've only got now 5 minutes. So Earthrin, let me come back to you with that real big, impossible to answer question.
It's not impossible to answer, because if you have a president that is willing to acknowledge that there is a problem, you start there, because you can't reform unless you can acknowledge the problem and move towards resolution. But there's also some very concrete actions that the president could take. And that is, as we talked about closing the Black wealth gap, is prioritizing federal contracts, which total approximately $560 billion annually, with 4.1 million contractors. 7.2% of those contracts, or only 7.1%, were awarded to Black Americans in 2018. There's an opportunity there to grow businesses. U.S. venture capital invested in 2019 totaled $130 billion. Black-owned businesses received less than 1% of the VC capital investment. I can go on, but I just say that the next president, if I was coaching and talking to President Biden, I would say that prioritizing the policies that can support the government action and prioritizing the advocacy that will catalyze private sector action to change these numbers, to create opportunities for building communities that have the potential for providing economic growth, yes, jobs, but also wealth. That's not a dirty word in the Black community. We should have the ability to move from intergenerational poverty in Black communities to intergenerational wealth building opportunities.
Earthryn, thank you very, very much. I wish we could have a longer conversation today, but in this book that we've just published, you can find it at asgbooks.com. It's available electronically. We'll have it available in book form as well, but right now, asgbooks.com. Deanna.
I would underscore some of the points I made earlier on this. First and foremost, I agree, just acknowledging the issue and acknowledging that as our research demonstrates very, very clearly, where families of color, particularly Black families, have the financial liquid buffer, their financial outcomes are just as they are for whites, as they are for everyone else. And we have had so many structural issues that have prevented Black families from establishing those levels of wealth. And we need to acknowledge that as reality of the way our economy has unfolded and tackle systematically ways to improve that wealth gap. And, you can start with tax policies that embed the legacy of poverty. You can access to education, and as we heard earlier, and access to housing, which has been a foundation for wealth building in America. But I think even if we just had a completely different tone, we would go a long, long way. So I hope we get that sooner rather than later.
Deanna, thank you very, very much. And you can read Deanna's article on this subject of opportunities for the African-American and Hispanic communities at asgbooks.com. And I want to thank Deanna for writing that article. And you can read Ayan's article as well in our book. Ayan, you have the last word on this subject.
Nick, thank you very much. You asked the question, what should we do about either we have a re-election of Donald Trump or we have Joe Biden as our next president. I learned when I was in politics, you just have to work with what you have. And if Donald Trump is re-elected, unfortunately, we do have to work with him because we can't wait another 4 years for him to get out of office before we address these issues. And there are a number of prominent Black Americans who are actually working with him. And, he's done a few things on, I would say, it's not what we want by far, but he's taken a few steps in the direction of reforming the criminal justice system and things like that. If Joe Biden is elected, indeed, I would say we really have to do something about education. Again, I can't insist enough. Our public schools, for the richest, most powerful country in the world, our public schools are just so bad. I mean, my schools in Nairobi, in some ways, are better than some of the schools that we see in California, Illinois, New York. It's just crazy. So I would say the biggest priority would be to revolutionize our schooling and dedicate resources to that. And then we can talk to the private sector about hiring. We can talk about all sorts of different things, but education is key. Thank you.
Ayan, thank you. And when Joe and I and Condi Rice and Anya Manuel and I were thinking about what we should do this summer for our big conversation over 2 days on American foreign policy, we decided we had to begin at home. We had to begin with race. We had to begin with the economic crisis, the recession. We had to begin with the coronavirus and the crisis, those three interlocking crises. And I felt a lot of us felt that the discussions we had, Condi Rice, Deval Patrick, Mitch Landrieu, Earthryn Cousin, Ayan Hirsi Ali, on race was the most important discussion we had, because it is the existential problem that the country has faced since its founding. So I want to thank you, Ertharin, and Deanna, and Ayan. A quick conversation, but a very good one. And you can find two of the chapters in this book, Domestic and International Disorder, A Strategic Response, at asgbooks.com. Two of the chapters are by Ayan Hirsi Ali and Deanna Farrell. Thanks to all three of you. We appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. We're going to transition very quickly to our next conversation, which is going to be about the challenges the United States faces in foreign policy around the world. And I see that my good and close friend, Jane Harman, is on the screen. I'm hopeful that Phil Zelikow will activate. He has his screen, and Tori Taussig. I introduced them all before. I'll introduce them again. Jane is the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, spent 2 decades in Congress, one of our great experts on the intelligence community, on homeland security, on national defense, on everything under the sun about American foreign policy. Phil Zelikow, professor at University of Virginia, former director of the Aspen Strategy Group. I think one of the most important intellectual thinkers, strategic thinkers about the future of America and the world. And Philip has written, and Jane have written really important chapters for our book that is available on asgbooks.com. And finally, but not finally, but Tori Taussig of Harvard University. Tori is a fellow at Harvard. She is directing our new project, and we're working together on this project on the future of the transatlantic relationship, a Harvard report that will be coming out in about 3 weeks' time, a nonpartisan report. So this is an impossible conversation to have. In Aspen, we had this over 2 days, and I sent an email to Jane and Phil and Tori yesterday saying, I really want to focus on just your thoughts on your recommendations to the next president. And you can decide on your answer, Jane. We'll leave with you. Whether or not that's Donald Trump you want to recommend to, or Joe Biden, that's your choice. But if there was one thing that America had to do to right the ship in our foreign policy, our national security policy, what would it be? And just for people listening to this, we focused a lot on China and the Aspen Strategy Group, obviously that multifaceted competitor. We focus a lot on Russia. We have major problems in deciding what to do after 2 decades of war in the Middle East and South Asia. We have climate change. We have the lack of a global response on the coronavirus, a lack of an effective global response by the United States and the G20 and China. So Jane, let me lead with you. I mean, how would you answer that question?
Well, first, Nick, thank you for including me in this conversation. I've loved my 23 years so far as a member of the Aspen Strategy Group and my decade as a trustee of the Aspen Institute, on top of other things that I do. But it's a very special place, and you're a very special friend. So thank you.
Thank you for with us.
My answer to that question is heal the country. I actually don't think we can have a strong foreign policy and project any form of leadership if we don't have American support for that policy. That doesn't mean every single card-carrying Democrat or Republican, but it means the majority of the American people believing in their leaders, respecting their institutions, leveraging the enormous resource of the private sector, and offering, not just in Congress, although that's a place I would start, if not a unified voice, a majority, a substantial voice on behalf of American strategy and goals. And so I'm really glad I'm not running for re-election this year, just saying. Congress is broken. I don't think anyone has missed that. And if we just exchange sides and we do payback again, I think that will be a very unfortunate outcome. But for example, just to illustrate my thought, Congress could, the next Congress, led by a president who wants to heal the country, actually focus on authorizing the use of military force in certain parts of the world, if that's necessary, could focus on a framework around our surveillance policies, which have created a lot of mistrust both in the United States and abroad, could focus on amending the Federal Vacancies Act so that the people in place leading departments, especially in the intelligence area, which is what I want to get to in 1 second, are confirmed by Congress and oversight can work again. Developing a budget system where we don't just have continuing resolutions and so forth. And I think if those things happened, a president, I think Biden would be my more likely candidate to be able to do this, would have the support he and a very qualified team need to relaunch American leadership. It won't be the same as the old leadership, but build back better is also, I think, a wonderful phrase for foreign policy. Let me just take 1 minute and talk about what I wrote about in your book, because I think it was under stressed in the wonderful sessions we had this summer. But my theory of the case is that good intelligence is a key ingredient to good foreign policy. And that how we understand the threats against America posed by China, Russia, jihadis, let's notice the attacks in France this week, requires state-of-the-art intelligence. I think that in a golden age of misinformation, our adversaries hide their intentions, and it is important to understand which of our negotiating partners or our enemies are ready to strike a deal, or which are ready to strike us or pick our pockets. And I say that the big problems here are politicization, which didn't start with this administration, but which is now an art form, politicization of intelligence, extensive surveillance where we collect everything we can and where the reaction of the private sector is to encrypt everything it can. That's a lose-lose proposition. I think that a third problem is fixing the Federal Vacancies Act. And finally, I say that reinstituting and reinvigorating things like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and creating transparency in what our intelligence agencies do is a way to strengthen them, not weaken them. And again, to close, we need to heal the country, and we need to figure out a way to jumpstart a really solid and robust and future-oriented and technologically based intelligence community.
Jane, thank you very much. You got a lot in a very short period of time, and I thank you for that. Let me just say, I've been advised by my friends on the chat column here that I've been misadvertising the books. It is not asgbooks.com. We're not a com. It's asgbooks.org. So I apologize to all my friends at the Aspen Strategy Group. Jane, in addition to reinventing and renewing American intelligence, if you think about the defense community, the intelligence community, there's the State Department. And this, I'm really leading to my friend Phil Zelikow here. There's the need to elevate American diplomacy, because diplomacy is going to have to lead to reinvigorate our alliances, to figure out how to get out of Afghanistan. It's really a diplomatic function. And certainly to lead on climate change and the big coalitions that we need to build with our alliances. Phil Zelikow is a former member of the U.S. Foreign Service. He served as counselor, which is one of the 4 or 5 undersecretary jobs to Secretary Condoleezza Rice. I admire, Phil and I are lifelong friends, but I admire his ability to see into the future. And Phil, I'm going to ask you the impossible question that I asked Jane. What's the most important thing that the new president should think about to restore American leadership in the world and activity and engagement with the world?
Nick, thanks. And thanks for those inordinately gracious comments.
Well deserved.
Let's suppose that I was a policy planner for the Secretary of State, and he said, what could I do? What could we do right at the start of the administration that would be pretty low-hanging fruit, that we could do fairly quickly, that would set a really strong message? My answer to that question would be this: unwind the tariff war with Europe. Unwind the tariff war with Europe. Now, how do I get to that? First, I actually, as I outlined in my paper, I make some arguments for really big ideas about moving towards trying to work on the 21st century agenda, which is a multi-year project, which requires a lot of engagement to work on problems like biological security or climate change or digital security and cyber and the rebooting global capitalism. But you can't do any of those things right away. Those are all big, long projects. But the point I'd stress about all those projects is the United States will not get any of the results it desires on any of those agenda items unless we can renew our partnership with the Europeans. That's just a core prerequisite for successful work on any of those problems, bar none, including, by the way, Iran, China, and Russia, if that's what you're worried about. So point one is anything we're going to want to do over the next couple of years requires renewed partnership with the Europeans. Point two, yes, of course, everyone's going to say we're going to change the tone. Instead of sounding hostile and bumptious, we're going to be friendly and cordial. Got that. And the Europeans will,
It's important, Philip.
We'll say, that's nice. At least the president isn't tweeting off at us. But what would make a lot more difference is to do something that's real, concrete, tangible, and affects people in their domestic politics. And that's where the tariff war comes in. This has had a real impact both in the United States and in Europe, and including in politically sensitive constituencies like agriculture and industry. So first point is you've got to clear the air with the Europeans to do anything big you want to work on. Second point, unwinding the tariff war would be a strong and tangible way to do that rather quickly. Three, and the third point is that unwinding the tariff war doesn't really cost us much in the US economy. The tariff war mostly got going using issues in metals and aircraft. The longstanding arguments about Boeing and Airbus, a set of longstanding arguments about steel and aluminum, where we hit the Europeans with tariffs in addition as part of worldwide steel and aluminum tariffs. The Airbus Boeing tariff reasons are gone. Airbus has canceled the A380 aircraft. That was a big reason for that. Both Airbus and Boeing are right now flat on their back, and this kind of beggar thy neighbor approach is actually hurting both companies at a very bad time for both of them. In metals, the Wall Street Journal just this morning ran a story pointing out that the tariffs on steel and aluminum aren't even helping the steel industry, the American steel industry, that much less the problems they're causing in raising prices for input materials in American manufacturing. So just to come back where I started, you said, what would be low-hanging fruit that a new Secretary of State could tackle that would send a strong, tangible message very soon, unwind the tariff war with Europe?
Philip, thank you very much. It's a really good segue to Tori. But I'll just say this, I'll pile on and agree with you that this is probably the most important thing to do, to strengthen our alliances and turn those alliances in a more positive strategic direction, because a lot of Europeans have the same complaints the EU does about China's trade practices, as does the United States. Is there a leveraging that could go on between the EU and the United States? Not a full-blown trade agreement, but a leveraging of our interests vis-a-vis China. You could even add Japan to that, and that'd be about 60% of global GDP. But Tori's been working on this issue. Tori's the research director, as I said before, of our Harvard project on the future of the transatlantic relationship, which is going to appear in mid-November. And Tori spent a year in Germany as a Bosch Fellow. She's been thinking a lot about how you'd lift up this relationship. You want to give a sneak preview, Tori, of what we're going to recommend in that report?
Yes, and thank you very much, Ambassador Burns, for the invitation to join this discussion. At this point, I think both Jane and Phil have touched on a number of issues that I would dovetail on and highlight as well. I mean, I think to go back to your original question, what can the United States do to regain the mantle of global leadership, to rebuild its alliances and partnerships around the world? I mean, not to be political, but I do think many of us on this call would agree that it will be easier should Vice President Biden be elected to the White House in November. However, either administration will need to take critical steps to regain some of the leadership that we've lost in the last few years. I want to point out two major challenges that are facing the United States and Europe at this critical juncture. There's a litany of issues we could go into, but I'll focus on the geopolitical for the moment. During this time of global pandemic and a focus on turning inwards, rebuilding our health institutions, our domestic economies, I think we've lost sight of the geopolitical competitors of the moment, which is that we have an authoritarian Russia and an authoritarian China that are seeking to weaken our democratic institutions and norms from without. If we focus particularly on the European security order, we have a Russia that is still undermining European sovereignty, European security, and European prosperity through both conventional military and hybrid means. And as we'll get into in the next conversation, we have a China that presents an authoritarian alternative in an international order where liberal democracy is weakening from within. Why do I mention these two geopolitical competitors to begin with? Because it is going to require two things, both what Jane and Phil have touched on in order to meet those challenges as a transatlantic community. One is reinvesting in our domestic institutions and our domestic democratic foundations at home. And the second is in investing in our traditional alliances and partnerships abroad, first and foremost with our European counterparts. I think what Phil mentioned in ending the trade war, ending the tariffs on steel and aluminum, first and foremost with our European partners, would go far in setting a kind of renewed foundation. I would also add that there can be room for a symbolic reset. I mean, particularly if there is a President Biden, showing up in European capitals, going to Brussels, having summits with EU officials, with leading European politicians, whether that be Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, just saying, the United States is back and we're reinvesting in this relationship is important. That being said, I also think that if there were to be a Biden administration, things don't go back to being perfect within the transatlantic relationship. They weren't before, and they won't be on day one. We're going to need to ask a lot of our European counterparts in pushing back against these geopolitical challenges that I mentioned at the onset from Russia and China. We have a Europe that's currently divided on China policy, that's divided on whether, for example, telecommunications provider Huawei should be building out 5G networks. We have a Europe that's divided on energy security and energy providing from Russia. And so we're going to have to ask a lot from our European counterparts to step up and unite around these geopolitical challenges as well. One of the issues that Ambassador Burns and I have been discussing in our transatlantic project is what role should the European Union play in developing a more united and stronger Europe? What role should Germany play in leading a stronger and more united Europe? I think these are critical challenges that either a Trump administration or a Biden administration will face, and will be issues that they have to deal with on day one. I'll close by saying that going back to US obligations in strengthening the US-Europe partnership will be in reinvesting in multilateral institutions and agreements that we've withdrawn from over the last few years. First and foremost being the Paris Climate Accords. Another that's going to require a significant amount of tension is the Iran nuclear deal, a treaty of significant importance to the Europeans that I think America's withdrawal from has led to viewing the United States as an unreliable and unpredictable partner. So those are just a few issues to put forward at the onset. And again, I do want to really hammer home what both Jane and Phil have said about rebuilding the domestic democratic foundations in our country in order to compete with authoritarian challenges abroad. And also to what Phil said, I mean, really reinvesting in traditional alliances and partnerships in Europe, first and foremost by ending these hyper unilateral policies that have made Europe out to be a competitor would be top of my list.
Tori, thank you. I certainly agree, and we're working together on this. That there's a lot we can do to reinforce NATO and return the United States to the leadership of NATO, to work and improve, and this is where Phil started, our relationship with the European Union on trade, and to be sensible about it. On the other hand, is we've got to look forward and we can't go back. The Europeans don't have a united policy on China strategically. They haven't figured out what to do on 5G as their allies in the Indo-Pacific and in North America turn against Huawei. There's the issue of tech regulation by the EU of our tech companies. There's a digital services tax. Iran's going to be extraordinarily complicated as an issue because of the aggressiveness of Iran throughout the Middle East. So this is not going to be always an easy discussion, but the United States will return to the center of it. We've got 8 minutes left in this rapid fire conversation. I want to ask Jane, and I know Jane's going to leave exactly at 11, and Phil and Tori, can we look beyond Europe at what else the United States should be doing if restoring alliances and partnerships is part of it? Joe Biden has said we'll go back into the World Health Organization, we'll go back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We also have the Indo-Pacific. We have the Quad as a possible future instrument to balance China and China's to be competitive with China and try to limit China's ambitions. We have the priority of North Korea and the failure of attempts by the Trump administration to deal with the nuclear weapons program. We have Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of issues here. Jane, Phil, Tori, what else would you advise the next president?
Well, Nick, if you're starting with me, I just want to give a shout out to one of Trump's ambassadors currently serving, Kay Bailey Hutchison, the
That's
ambassador
right.
to NATO, a post you used to have, who tries very hard to keep it going, keep it fresh. Yeah. And I think it's the kind of steep hill she climbs, but she does it effectively. And to remind everyone, as you often do, that while you were ambassador on 9/11, NATO invoked Article 5 for the one and only time without being asked to come to the support of the United States. So that's a big deal. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we restore, reinvigorate, reinvent our role in NATO and NATO's role in Europe and as a North American defense alliance. To Asia, the one thing we haven't listed yet is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which I think Trump precipitously withdrew from. That was a brilliant idea, started in the Obama administration, that's probably why he withdrew, to join with the economies of Asia to support them and us, to advocate for common standards, and knowing that all of them, and we are major trading partners with China. If what we are trying to do with respect to China, I'll just answer that part because others have lots of knowledge here, is be an effective strategic competitor, not an enemy. The best way to do that is through a resurrected trading alliance in Asia. And when we withdrew, Japan stepped up, and there still is TPP without the US and without as much clout as it would have if we were in it. So I would recommend that we put that on the list of alliances we should restore, along with making, I would say, the Paris Accord much stronger. I mean, China could still be in it and get away with building coal-fired plants, which it is now doing. I think 70, I don't know if it's 70 a month or 70 a year. 70 a month sounds much scarier. And so I'm saying that restoring all of this, putting the talented team that I think a President Biden could build to work would be a huge step forward.
Jane, thank you. And I know you've got to get off the screen and go on to another speech you're going to give. I thank you very much for being here. Phil, what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm asking you an impossible question here to answer in a couple of minutes. What else do you think is very important for the next president?
Taking up your invitation to switch the focus to Asia for a moment. The number one thing I'd wave about is Taiwan. I think Taiwan right now is the first, second, and third most dangerous issue in the Asia-Pacific region. And the concrete thing I'd recommend doing about that is prepare for and engage in significant strategic conversations about Taiwan with Japan. There's right now going on a furor about what the US should say or do about Taiwan and strategic ambiguity and all of that. What is striking to me when I read that and listen to these conversations, if anyone actually works in these problems for a little while, everything turns actually on the posture of Japan in this matter. if you play these things out for more than about 5 minutes and you don't view them through a narrowly military lens, the position of Japan is simply pivotal on how to think about Taiwan. The Japanese have greater interests in this matter than we do, by far. Therefore, I think nothing that we do about Taiwan can go forward unless it is a joint US and Japanese strategic understanding. And I'm not satisfied that the United States has reached that kind of deep joint strategic understanding with the Japanese about how to think about the most dangerous situation in the Asia Pacific.
Philip, thank you. And Philip will remember, Philip and I were young Foreign Service officers in the State Department's Executive Secretariat back in 87, 88, when George Shultz was Secretary of State. And Philip, I remember Secretary Shultz saying repeatedly in those years, long time ago, Japan is the strongest and most important American ally in the world. And as our attention shifts strategically to the Indo-Pacific, to the question you've identified, and the larger landscape of US and China, which Joe and I and Tom Pritzker, Naima Green-Riley are going to discuss in a minute, certainly Taiwan has got to be a focus. We spent some time talking the last 2 years at the Aspen Strategy Group about this. I'll just say it's good to see the Trump administration sending the Secretary of Health and Human Services to Taipei and the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, but you've got to have a more serious strategic engagement with the Japanese and certainly the Australians about this issue, no question. Philip, thank you. Tori, we're essentially out of time. We've got 2 minutes, but what else would you recommend? I mean, you're an expert on Europe, but I know that your strategic focus is also on China. What would you recommend to the president?
It's a great segue into the following conversation about great power, geopolitical competition between the United States and Europe, which I think will be a defining challenge for the next century. A challenge for the US and Europe is that Europe does not look at the Indo-Pacific, does not look at Asia-Pacific as a strategic theater in the way that the United States does. It is unlikely that our European partners will view China as a military competitor, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, in the way that the United States does and will continue to do so in the years ahead. That being said, and Ambassador Burns, you brought up NATO. NATO has started to look at China as a more critical challenge and threat within our own transatlantic community of democracies. China's purchasing and acquisition of strategic ports is an important issue for NATO to focus on within the West, even if we are not pivoting the alliance to focus on the Asia Pacific. And so I think that that's a positive trend that we should continue to push in US foreign policy in the years ahead, having NATO focus more critically on China as a strategic challenge within our own theater of the US and Europe relationship. And finally, I'll add, I think it's important that we see continued cooperation, enhanced cooperation between the US, Europe, and our Asia partners, Japan and South Korea, on a range of issues from technology, trade, to development, because this is where I do think you could have more concerted cooperation between Europe and Asia if it's not going to be in the field of military competition in the Asia Pacific.
Nick, you're on mute.
Tori, thank you very much. We're going to look forward to our Harvard report on the future of the transatlantic relationship, but you can read, if you're watching and listening to this, you can read chapters by Tori Tasic and Phil Zelikow, expanding on what they said today. I want to thank both of them for being with us today. And I want to welcome my friend and partner in the Aspen Strategy Group, Anya Manuel, and Zoe Baird, whose I think image is going to appear right now. There she is. Anya, as I hand this off to you, and you're going to share the conversation with Zoe and then the panel on China, I don't think we've had a better member of our group than Zoe Baird. And the Markle Foundation has been with us, supporting us intellectually in every way for 10 years now. So I want to thank Zoe for that publicly. And take it away, Anya. Zoe, looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. What a great way to start us off. And Zoe, Nick stole my thunder. That's what I was going to say. Zoe needs no introduction. She's the CEO and president of the Markle Foundation, has had a distinguished career in both law, including as general counsel of Aetna, and many senior roles in the US government. And Zoe, couldn't be a better time for a Markle Foundation initiative that you were really the engine behind, which you call the Rework America initiative. And so while for those of our participants listening, it's pretty unusual for the Aspen Strategy Group to spend as much time as we did last summer on domestic issues, race issues, democracy, political division, and the economy, we felt it was absolutely critical to do so this year because, as Jane Harman said, we have to strengthen ourselves economically in order to be effective in foreign policy. So Zoe, maybe I can just start with that. You argue in your paper that we have to start at home, but that's not obvious to many people who work in the foreign policy community. Can you say a little bit about why you think national security and economic policy are tied?
Well, first, let me thank you and Nick for your extraordinary leadership of the Aspen Strategy Group and all my colleagues in the Aspen Strategy Group for their passion and commitment. This is a group of people who work hard, listen to each other, and I really have observed we've all grown as we've learned from each other with many different political perspectives over the years. What I want to talk about and talked about in my chapter in the book is what I think of as integration of government. I think we're at a critical point, and my hat's off to you for having an agenda that includes both some of the critical domestic issues and traditional foreign policy issues, because I think we're at a critical moment where America's place in the world is dependent on America's shared economic prosperity at home. That broadly shared economic prosperity is really a bedrock of America's both economic and political strength. And I've done some work with my colleague Phil Zellico, the historian, and learned a lot from him. And I just remind people, particularly younger people who are hopefully new to and passionate about being part of foreign policy going forward, that after World War II, the US grew the middle class to unprecedented strength and size. And this was a critical component of our influence on the global stage. It wasn't just our might in the war, it was our investment in Europe and the Marshall Plan. It was our creating the American dream at home as a model for aspiring nations around the globe. We are not in that place right now. Right now, we have profound inequities in our country. Inequities that grew out of this crisis, but inequities that existed and have been built over the last several decades. And to my mind, the legitimacy of our democracy is at risk if we can't address and rebuild an equitable economy and rebuild the American dream. I mean, just looking at where we are right now, workers of color and people who don't have a bachelor's degree, which are almost 70% of Americans, have been profoundly hit by this downturn in the economy. They have been unable to manage, and Deanna made some comments about that in terms of the Black community and the challenges at all economic levels, but the impact is so disproportionate on people without a bachelor's degree or people of color. For people who don't have a high school degree, in August, the rate of unemployment was more than double the rate for people with a bachelor's degree. Ambassador Cousin talked about some of the structural inequities, the importance of rebuilding Black wealth and capitalism. In all of our programs, foreign and domestic, we need to be thinking about how to impact that and change that equation. Most small businesses are small proprietorships. As we think about the trade issues and the tariff issues that were being discussed earlier today, we need to have strategies that include the voices of workers and small businesses so that the solutions we seek don't simply further the inequities that have been built into our economy in the last several decades. We need with intention to say, how are we going to use the tools of foreign policy and our relationships with other countries to rebuild an equitable economy at home and rebuild the American dream?
Perfect. Thank you. A perfect explanation of why this is so critical. The great thing is that your paper is also highly practical and talks about how to make it happen. You talk about a modern labor market. And can you just explain a little bit, what do you mean by that? What do we need to change?
My hope in the next several years is that the federal government will invest deeply in creating more good jobs and in preparing people for them. One of the accelerants this pandemic has brought is transforming us to a digital economy. And while Diana at JP Morgan is able to make sure everyone who works for them have laptops or telephones to connect, those Black small businesses that are mostly sole proprietorships don't have the resources or capacity to do that. And even if we're able to get people the funds, the loans to be able to get the connections they need, we still need to give people the opportunity to get the digital skills they need. The fastest rate of digitization in our economy and the global economy has been in the lowest paying jobs. And yet we have no system of adult learning and training that makes it easy for people to rapidly and affordably get that training. So a modern economy, in my mind, will require, to get out of this pandemic and recessionary double hit, will require federal investment in job creation. Some of that will be public sector jobs like contact tracers. Some of it will be private sector jobs. It will be part of other major ambitions, presumably, for infrastructure, for clean energy, for health. But in doing that, again, this point about integration of government, we need to have intentional strategies to enable Blacks, Latinx, women, people across this country at all education levels to participate and to benefit both with the policies that we pursue, but also in the training that they need in order to effectively engage in a new economy. And one of the most important ways to do that, I have to underscore, which we haven't talked about yet, is to actually include their voice in making those decisions. And this is why I emphasize the notion of integration of government. We should not have a State Department making decisions about restoring relations with other countries without hearing from the workers and the people of color who want to have a part in that, who want to have a stake in that. We should not be making decisions about trade. We should not be making decisions about how we're going to bring home supply chains and what new agreements we need with other nations to bring home supply chains without making sure that we have the voice of workers and the voice of people of color making the decisions, not just someone being appointed because they meet a criteria to a job, but rather being empowered to be a decision maker in our major policy decisions, both foreign and domestic.
Right. That's a very good point, and one we don't usually talk about. I mean, input, who has input to our trade policy? Unions, sometimes, sometimes NGOs, but often it's just big corporate interests, and small businesses and others who are really the majority of our country don't have a lot of input. So,
and we haven't on the in the national, we're bad enough in the domestic side, but in the foreign policy, national security side of government, and I've worked and participated in policymaking in both, we have no structures for engaging that voice. You know, is the Secretary of Labor a co-equal decision maker with the US trade rep on trade policy? And the networks and communities that come with that then become very different in terms of who you invite to be at the table, as opposed to who has to try to break down the door.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zoe. You and I could discuss this all morning. I'm sorry we have such a short amount of time. Thank you for contributing, for writing a paper, for being such a great member of the Aspen Strategy Group and thought partner to us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We now turn to the country that is at top of mind for everyone, the Trump administration, future Biden administration, if there is one. And I'm inviting to the stage, please, Joe Nye, who needs no introduction. Joe is already here, a distinguished service professor of Harvard University, co-chair of the Aspen Strategy Group, of course, former dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard and longtime public servant. Naima Green Riley, who was a foreign service officer in Egypt and in China and is now a PhD candidate at Harvard University and undergrad from Stanford. And Tom Pritzker, also a great member of our group, who's the chairman and CEO of the Pritzker Organization and the executive chairman of Hyatt. And just to our audience members out there, we have 24 unbelievable papers that are part of this book that we hope you will look up online and read. And the reason we're doing this sort of staccato and TED style is because we wanted to highlight as many of these interesting and unusual arguments as possible. So Tom, let me start with you, because you as a business person have a perspective on China that's somewhat different from that of those of us who've been mostly in government. And it's an issue that foreign policy circles don't often discuss. You argue that to compete effectively with China's version of state capitalism in this unprecedented race that we're entering, you say we need to do a lot more to coordinate the US private and public sectors, but do it without a top-down industrial policy, in the bad name that industrial policy sometimes takes, the term of the government picking winners and losers. What do you mean, and how should we go about it?
Okay, thanks, Anya. Thanks, Nick, for doing this. So I start and say the world has changed dramatically, and we need to tailor a strategy to that new world, not just a China strategy, but actually a global strategy. Three massive changes that I would point to. First, China's developed a system of state capitalism, as you suggested, Anya, and it's been successful. They've also clearly been quite direct about their intent to challenge the US leadership model and create a China model as a competing model for global leadership. Second, tech is going to drive national wealth going forward. Tech has a different business model than do traditional industries. Our strategy has to understand that. Third, the world is uber connected. Everyone is connected. The farmers in the field have smartphones and they have a voice, and countries are now we're going to compete with China for their affection, and their affection is going to follow their economic interests. So major changes that we have to integrate into how we think about strategy. Paradoxically, it's in the economic sphere where communist China has decided to describe the battleground. That's the battleground they've chosen. It's not military, it's not diplomatic at its core. At its core, it's economic. So let's look at why they would choose that economics as their battleground. First, they have significant scale. Scale is a huge advantage in business, and they've got it. Second, they have a system of value and a culture that's deeply embedded that puts society ahead of the individual. Look at their response to COVID and how effective that was. And those value systems support this state capitalism approach to economics. Third, they have the ability to integrate their commercial sector into their national security and into their foreign policy because it's centrally coordinated. So the visual I want to suggest here is when Xi Jinping goes to sleep at night, he lays down, he closes his eyes, and he starts muttering, "It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid." And that's how he visualizes. Yes, exactly. So let's go to our strategy. So what I'm suggesting is not just a China strategy, but actually a strategy for the 21st century world that we're facing. And I refer to it as a modern alliance-based industrial policy. So let me pick that apart. By modern, what I mean is look at the world we're facing, some of those massive changes that I described, and take those integrate those into the strategy. Don't make our strategy based on the old world, because that's not coming back. Second is alliance-based. What I mean by alliance-based is through alliances, we talked a little bit about TPP, we can actually create scale that is larger than China's. Without those alliances, we are at a scale disadvantage. The other thing I mean by alliance is that's going to help us embrace those countries who want to opt for a rules-based world order. And so that alliance system has many vectors to it, which work to our advantage. Third, I did use the term industrial policy, and I have to tell a quick story. What I don't mean by it is choosing winners and losers at the company level. So when I decided to use the term, I'm come out of the University of Chicago. I called my friend who holds the Becker-Friedman chair, that's as in Milton Friedman. And I said, Michael, I'm going to advocate for industrial policy. What happens to me in the University of Chicago cult? And he said, you will be excommunicated. I said, is there any penance? He said, none, no chance. As soon as it's published, we will start the proceedings. So today marks the proceedings where I'll be excommunicated. What I do mean by industrial policy is don't pick winners and losers at the company level, but pick them at the sector level. Prioritize what sectors are important to our future. So I would look and say AI is critical, quantum is critical. We could all go through and prioritize. And if we do that, we then come up with the beginnings of a framework. So people prefer public-private partnership as a term. What I would say is if we want to use that, think of it as the public sector investing in those prioritized sectors and building the physical infrastructure and the intellectual infrastructure that will induce the private sector to invest, to build companies, to innovate around those areas. And I think if we could, that's what I mean by industrial policy. The advantage of a strategy along these lines is it provides an organizing principle, not only with respect to China, but with respect to the 21st century. And importantly, it would move us away from what I see as dangerous rhetoric with respect to China and towards a rhetoric that is actually about domestic prosperity. So that's that. I use the term intentionally because it's provocative, but that's what I mean by industrial policy.
Thank you, Tom. That's a really great introduction to a complicated issue. I actually, in my paper for this volume, talk specifically about the technology race with China. And I think that's part of what you mean. And I think we have a similar view that industrial policy doesn't mean, well, Boeing wins or Intel wins, but it means, wow, if semiconductors are really an important building block of our national security, how do we make sure that we and our friends and allies continue to be the most competitive and most innovative countries in that space? So
yep.
We're talking about a similar idea. Naima, I want to turn next to you. You are one of the younger participants in the group, and we're so happy to have you. You come with a really fresh, new perspective, and I know you've done your dissertation also on how China influences the world, both in the US and other countries, both through educational programs, public diplomacy initiatives, transnational news, and sometimes through more nefarious means. How has China used these channels, And how do we prevent our open system from being exploited while remaining open?
You're right, Anya. I focus mainly on public diplomacy. And usually when states are engaged in public-focused international engagement, the aim is to have impact on ordinary citizens, especially the type of impact that will benefit that state somehow. So China's using similar platforms that other countries use when they engage in public diplomacy in order to try to influence Americans. And that includes it includes broadcasting like CGTN, formerly known as CCTV. It includes print and online media like the China Daily, the Global Times, educational programs like Confucius Institutes and classrooms, which are often offered, or the programming there is often offered to Americans through some sort of partnership with a US university or school. And they're also using social media outreach. Well, public diplomacy has been around for a long time. I write in the chapter that we shouldn't make it into too much of a 10-foot boogeyman, because recently some members of Congress have, for example, worried that Confucius Institutes might be shaping the views of American youth that are harmful to the United States and in ways that are harmful to the United States. But at the end of the day, I think we need to remember that people are able to intuit what goes along with their values and what doesn't. And so in some of the research that I've been doing, I look at the effects of Confucius programming on American youth, teenagers. And I find that even in that context, young people are able to go into Confucius classrooms to learn Chinese and to come out with very complex conceptions of the Chinese state, very nuanced conceptions of the Chinese state. Now, the important thing is that Americans are equipped with the ability to discern where the information that they're consuming is coming from. So Confucius Institutes are funded by China. It's not a secret. And yet, and still, the institutions that host them need to make clear to folks that that's what they're signing up for. Similarly, in the information space, we need to do a lot of work to give Americans the tools that they need to be able to evaluate information critically. So media literacy programs at the K-12 level should be a good start. Social media labeling, which, for example, YouTube has done for several years. Facebook has just started to do this summer, will be useful because it allows people as they're scrolling through their social media feeds to be able to say, okay, this is a post that is coming from an outlet that has the backing of the CCP government in China or Russia's Kremlin or Iran. And so when I talk about information campaigns, I mean overt sort of state-backed news. That's the type of thing that we need to be labeling. When it comes to more covert actions in the information space, like coordinated inauthentic behavior, misrepresentation about who's purveying information online, spreading misinformation or disinformation, that's information that we need to address in a different way. It shouldn't really be there, and it shouldn't be getting to American citizens. To the extent that we can work with platforms to limit, detect, and get rid of that information, I think that's the way to go forward in that realm. And also I'll say—
Can I jump in and ask you one question about that piece of it specifically? Because the Trump administration has argued that Democrats are overly fixated on Russian disinformation. The Chinese have actually gotten pretty good at it as well. Do you see a lot of that, and should we be as concerned?
Well, I want to say that Russia is still a major actor of concern. And so this attempt to pivot away from Russia is unwise, because we know for a fact that Russian disinformation is still happening. It's still targeting a number of different communities all across the United States, often different racial groups, often immigrants, often people with strong ideological predispositions. So Russia is definitely not an actor that we should not be paying attention to. That being said, we are starting to see a number of other actors come into this space. So China has started to mimic Russia in a lot of ways in the information space. And we also see disinformation campaigns that are covert in nature that have started to reach out to American citizens that have been funded or that are being run by China. Iran has been involved in these types of activities as well. So the number of actors in the information space that have malign intent has increased.
Great, thank you. And just for our audience members, we're going to run a few minutes past the half hour because we want to give Joe a chance to tie it all up with a bow for us and make sure that I have some chance for follow-up with our other two great panelists and not cut this short. So if you're able to stay, that would be great. Naima, just one last follow-up, and then I want to turn to Joe for the overarching argument. I have recently been involved in a study group that's going to come out with a paper soon about basic science and how we preserve the openness there. Now, it's not specifically what you're writing about here, but that is kind of a gray area where in some cases it's just Chinese students studying and getting their PhDs here, taking things back home. In some instances, far more nefarious, where people are actually downloading intellectual property off university servers. Our view in the paper is, by and large, basic science needs to remain open and benefit the world, but there are a few safeguards, and they're similar to what you mentioned. Sunshine is the best remedy. So you need to know who's funding what research and why. Both our professors and our students need to be trained in what happens sometimes by the Chinese government and by others, and also what the consequences are if you are caught spying. Would you agree with that, or are there different prescriptions you would have?
I definitely agree. And I think that you're right. Sunshine is the best remedy. You're right that sometimes covert malign activity seeks to influence Americans. And we should be, first of all, on the public diplomacy side, monitoring that activity to make sure that there's ever any sort of indication that we veered into the territory of coercion or espionage or stealing information, intellectual property, or illegal activities. That's a point where we need to start to involve other actors, right? So maybe folks who are going to do more investigations, bring in some legal repercussions. But in the research space, I think that it's important for us to, first of all, look at the numbers. There's been some research on just how much of the research that's been sort of collaborated on with China actually involves espionage or stealing information, and the number is still pretty low. But to the extent that that does happen, I think that it's important for us to make people aware that that's a possibility, right? So the researchers that are engaging on important scientific topics might not be, well informed about sort of the global environment that they're operating in. So to the extent that we can just make sure that people are aware that that's a possibility, that will go a long way in sort of starting to make sure that we can detect when something like that is happening. And I'd refer people to Georgetown's CSET, it's a Center on Emerging Technologies, which has done a lot of great work on actually looking at how we can preserve cooperation with China in the scientific space while being aware of some of those threats.
That's right. Thank you very much. It's a really important area that is understudied, so we're glad you're doing it. Joe, last but certainly not least, you're one of our great foreign policy strategic thinkers, and your paper was more overarching about how we should approach China. And I want to lead in to letting you talk by picking up from something Phil Zelikow said in the last session, and that is Taiwan is the most dangerous issue. And Phil didn't say it, but there is some worry in foreign policy circles that if our election outcomes are uncertain, if there's turmoil domestically in the US in the next couple of months, that Beijing may use that time not to launch an invasion of Taiwan, but to do something, perhaps grab some of the islands that are administered by Taiwan, but that are much closer to the coast of the mainland, maybe do something of a cyber attack on Taiwan. So I want to lead in with that really dangerous, prominent issue, and then ask you to describe more generally how you would approach US policy towards China.
Well, I agree that Taiwan is a serious and important issue. I don't have the feeling that you're going to have a crisis between now and the end of the year or during the end of the Trump administration. I think we have to take more seriously the question of China's capacities increase. How do we preserve our capacity to deter the use of force by China? But I don't see that as a matter of months. I see that as a matter of years and decades. And I agree with Phil Zelikow that Japan is crucial on that. Rich Armitage and I have issued a report every 4 years on an election year about the importance of the US-Japan Security Treaty. We're going to issue another one this year. And one of the things we recommend is closer coordination between Japan and the US on the issue of Taiwan. But I'd rather go back to the larger picture and take us back to not to this summer, but to an Aspen strategy group in 2006, where we discussed China. And there was a good deal of, I would say, concern, but also optimism in the 2006 strategy group meeting. And what's striking is how that had vanished by our discussion the year before last and last year. And I think you could say, as I start my paper, is that US-China relations are the worst they've been in 50 years. That's led some people to start talking about a new Cold War, but I think that's lazy thinking, because the type of challenge we faced with China is totally different than the Cold War that we had with the Soviet Union. And here I think Tom Pritzker is exactly right, which is that it's really an economic and technological challenge. It's not an ideological challenge. I think, and here I agree with Naima as well, if you ask, is there anything like the Soviet challenge to us internationally in ideological terms? No. People aren't going to march in the streets for Xi Jinping thought with Chinese characteristics as it's enshrined in the party constitution. Indeed, China doesn't have as much soft power as it had under Mao, when people did march in places like Paris. And so they think the important thing is to realize that we have a different game that we're playing, and Tom was right about that. But I think it's also important to realize that we have a very strong hand to play. And the great problem with designing a strategy is either to underestimate or overestimate your opponent. And there's a great amount of overestimation that's going on now about China. People think they're 10 feet tall. They're not. If I were, as I say, an imaginary creature from Mars looking over the hands of these two players, the US and China, over the next 10 or 20 years, and I say, which hand would I rather play in this great poker game of great power competition? I'd much rather play the American hand. Some of the high cards we have are, for example, geopolitical. We have two oceans and friendly neighbors. China has 14 neighbors and intense conflicts over territory with some of them, such as India, Japan, and Vietnam. In energy, we are relatively energy independent. China is going to depend for the decade or more to come on imported oil through the Straits of Hormuz and the Indian Ocean, where the Americans have naval superiority. There's also demography, in which our labor force is likely to go up 5% in the next decade. China's labor force peaked in 2015. If you look at technology, the ability to develop new areas of technology, whether it's nano or bio or the next generation of information technology, of the 20 leading research universities in the world, as measured by Shanghai Jiaotong University, 15 of the 20 are in the United States, none are in China. And of course, there's also the dollar, which still remains preeminent as a store of value, even when we have problems with our economy. So in that sense, I think to design a strategy for China, we've got to play from our strength, which means working up some of these issues at home that we have to take care of, and which we've been talking about this morning. And that includes our democratic institutions, includes basically our openness, including to immigration, and it includes a strong R&D program in the technological sectors that Tom identified. But externally, what we can do is try to shape the environment in which Chinese power increases. Basically, that includes restructuring our legacy military systems so that we can maintain alliances with Japan, and South Korea and others, Australia, improving our relationships with India, working on the questions of international institutions so that we can cooperate with China in some areas where we need to cooperate, whether it's it's climate or pandemics or what have you. And finally, to set up consultative arrangements with China so that we manage this relationship where we cooperate when we can, compete where we must, but essentially a cooperative rivalry, which is a better description than a new Cold War, will require us to do a lot of systems management. And that's going to require us to strengthen our capacity to do that, working with allies, but also with the Chinese. That's what a strategy ought to look like. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Let's hope that we will.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was a lightning round on China policy, and we have much, much more to discuss. But in the interest of time, I want to leave it there. Thank you all. Thank you for all the work and time and joy and effort you put into participating in the Aspen Strategy Group. Thank you very much, Tom, Joe, and Naima. Thank you.
So thanks to our co-founder and our co-chair, Joe Nye. We wouldn't have the Aspen Strategy Group without Professor Joe Nye and without Condi Rice. Thanks to Naima. Thanks to Tom Pritzker. Anya, we're going to wrap up here. We still have lots of people online with us, and other people will watch this on our website in the days and weeks ahead. I thought maybe you and I should just, our takeaways. What do you take away from these TED Talk rapid fire conversations? Race, foreign policy, the economy, China, 4 big subjects.
4 big subjects. Well, I would pick up, Nick, where Joe just left off. If you're looking out a decade or 2, I'd still rather be playing the United States hand in the global context rather than the Chinese hand. And Joe mentioned some reasons, and I would just add to them slightly. And one is the following: authoritarian systems like China. It's looking pretty good right now. It had a V-shaped recovery. They cracked down hard on the virus, and so now there's very little of it, and so the economy can bounce right back. We're not having that, but when I teach this at Stanford, I often say authoritarian systems are like glass, they're rigid. So you tap them 100 times and nothing happens, tap it just the right way and it bursts. So you don't actually know what's going on inside the Chinese Communist Party and how stable Xi Jinping's rule is. In the US, boy, democracy looks messy and ugly right now, but it's resilient. If there is a president that a lot of people don't like, we have the opportunity to vote that person out. And that is great strength. And even though now we're going through a difficult time in our democracy, we've been through worse. We've been through the Civil War. We've been through the Great Depression. We've been to the upheavals of the 1960s. We're going to come through that too. So first, we're a democracy, so we're resilient. 2, a lot of people talked about our openness. Phil Zelikow talked about it, our openness to the world. Tom talked about it in the way our technologies and our industry works. It is an important, real strength of the United States that we are so open. And I hope that we don't make the mistake and become so afraid of China or of what's coming at us that we close ourselves off. I see this a lot in the technology space. I wrote about it a little bit in my paper for the book.
Right, you did.
You're not going to lock in American technology and keep it from going to China. You're not going to lock out Chinese technology. It's just not how the system works. So what we need to do instead is out innovate and out compete. And we can do that. We've done that before. Some of the things that Zoe talked about how do we reskill our workforce? How do we make sure that the economy is working for everyone, not just a few wealthy people in New York and in Silicon Valley? We can do that as well. So those are 2 of the big takeaways. A third half one, Joe mentioned, and we haven't talked much about finance, the dollar as a store of value and as the reserve currency for the world. I know when we met this summer, Larry Summers spoke to us, and he had something to say about that. He said it still is, but it may not be forever. And I just wanted to highlight that, even though we didn't talk about it this morning. It is true, but just like in technology, the Chinese are still behind, but objects in the mirror may be closer than they appear. That's, I think, the same thing with our financial fintech innovation. and with the dollar. If you look at the big innovations in financial technology, they're all in China. Ant Financial, Alipay, WeChat, those are coming up very fast. And in the US, we have been really innovative. Our companies are there, but the US government bureaucracy is killing a lot of these little fintech companies, not through malice, but just through the fact that it's easier for the bureaucracy to say no to something new than to say yes. And I hope we correct that. So those are my 3 big takeaways. How about you?
I fully agree with you. And on that last point, one of the chapters in our book, which people can find at asgbooks.org, is by Aditi Kumar, who's a very bright young scholar at Harvard Kennedy School. And she wrote a chapter on the digital currency issues and the problems with fintech and the opportunities and problems with fintech. And she's very much focused on that issue. Anya, first of all, I want to say, I think we're very proud of the group of people we have around the table. There was a time when the Aspen Strategy Group was frankly a lot of older white men like myself, but we had an age span in Aspen virtually this summer for 2 days, from people in their 20s to people in their 80s. And they were new and diverse voices. They're young scholars like Naima Green Riley and Tori Tausig and Aditi Kumar and Laura Coupe, really impressive people. And they're sitting down and exchanging views with Joe Nye and Condi Rice and Madeleine Albright and Ash Carter. And so I think that mix of being intergenerational and being highly diverse and reflecting American society is critical to the future of the Aspen Strategy Group, as it is to every institution in America. And I guess I'd say from our TED Talk rapid fire conversations this morning, I'd say that what struck me was, if we're thinking about American foreign policy in 2021, we have to begin at home. And we have to begin with the coronavirus and the recession and race, especially race, the third rail, the existential issue of American history. Second, I would say that certainly the United States has to lead. And we're not leading right now. We're not in the World Health Organization. We've left in the middle of the pandemic. Left the WHO to its own devices. We're the only country not in the Paris climate change agreement. We've weakened our alliances, and it's in the interest of the United States and the American people to be engaged with the world. It helps us and it helps the rest of the world. And I think there was a spirit around that issue, both in our conversations in August, but I think today that's palpable. And third, I say that stakes are very high for the United States. We're a nonpartisan organization. So I'm not going to say anything political about the choice on next Tuesday, November 3rd, but the stakes are very high that the United States get this right, and that we consider ourselves a leading country that's in the world and that's working with the world. And we have a Republican membership and a Democratic membership and lots of independent people, I think, who all agree on that. And I see that in the Congress among senior Republicans and senior Democrats. They want the United States to be engaged. And finally, I'd just say you and I have a close friend and in many ways a mentor, Condoleezza Rice, our co-chair, and she couldn't be with us today, but Condi has been saying for some time now, the American people need to be self-confident and the United States government needs to be self-confident. We should be self-confident. And I think Joe Nye really has it right. We have so many advantages in the world, structural, geopolitical advantages that we can build on and that Republicans and Democrats should be building together. And that's the best nonpartisan tradition of the Aspen Strategy Group. So I want to thank you, Anya. You're a great leader, and it's a pleasure to work with you. And I want to thank Neve King, who's our new, Neve basically runs the Aspen Strategy Group, not Anya and me. And we're so proud that Neve is with us. And we want to thank certainly John Hogan and Kathleen Shea and Jennifer Lawrence and Tobias Brandt, our 2 great Scowcroft Fellows, and everybody else who makes our Deb Cunningham, all the people who make our organization tick. Thanks to everybody for watching. asgbooks.org. Thank you, Anya.
Leah Batunis, who runs the
Leah Batunis, how can I forget Leah? My goodness.
One last plug for the book. You have it here. It's at asg.org, and you please all get a copy because there are really, really interesting papers in there. Thank you, Nick, for everything you do.
Thanks, Anya.
All of you in the audience will join us again for our next program. Thank you.